So it's 1970 now, and I'm making a film called Persistent and Finagling, whose very first shot tells you something quite important about the observational documentary. The camera is outside a suburban house at night, and the lens is slowly zooming in through a window on a group of women who are inside, and they're having some sort of a meeting. What this tells you is there's an element of surveillance, of spying about the observational camera. In this case, it's not hostile surveillance at all, because we go inside and we meet young mothers who've part of a group called STOP. And they're concerned about the growing pollution of the city of Montreal, 1970. The air was getting worse and worse, and they've got young kids, and they're very worried about what their kids are breathing. So I'm seeing that they're a good story in a sort of a Griersonian sense. They're trying to change something. But I'm also looking for elements that will be part of what later became my checklist of what makes a good documentary. I didn't have that list in my mind at that time, way back then, but intuitively I knew certain things. For instance, this was going to be a campaign that STOP was running that had a finite end. So there's going to be a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Secondly, there was going to be something at stake, because would they succeed in their plan? Thirdly, what about the characters? Well, Sheila Shulman, the leader of the group, there's something about her. She wasn't in any way an extravagant person or over the top, but there's something about her quiet leadership style that I really liked. And I thought, this is a character that I'm interested to follow and see how she goes. And the other women with her, Sally Bochner and the others, Kay, were also interesting. So what was it, this story that was going to unfold in front of my camera? Well, they had decided that a way to identify and put the finger on these massive polluters around the city was to do a bus tour, which was an ironic version of the city bus tours that showed you all the beautiful things around Montreal. This bus would go around and it would stop outside the factories that were spewing out the muck, and they'd have an expert on the bus who would say what was going into the air and what should be done about it. They're going to have this bus tour, and they're going to have journalists on the bus. That was the idea. But would they get the journalists? Quite a lot at stake. So there's this meeting going on, and in the kitchen is Sheila's husband, Larry. Now, he's obviously a supporter, but he's also worried about the women. He's worried about whether they're stepping outside their comfort zone. We overhear one of the women in the group saying what they'll basically be doing is putting polluters on trial with this bus, and that's not a good idea, that you can't accuse people like that. And everybody gets worried. And Larry is saying, when that word confrontation came up, you see how they all got worried. He's talking to me in the kitchen. So he's like a sort of a Greek chorus in the background, talking about what the women are doing. And I'm somewhat intervening as well. At least I'm listening to him. So it's an interesting sort of stylistic thing that I'm juxtaposing the women talking in the room about what they're going to do, about the bus, and Larry making his comments in the kitchen. As soon as the meeting is finished, a key thing happens. Sheila says to me, well, what did you think of the meeting? Were you impressed? She's obviously inviting me to act as a coach, as a referee on their activities. Do they come up to scratch? She's also, of course, wondering whether they're interesting enough to be the subject of a film, which I'm probably wondering too. Anyway, I choose a non-committal answer, but it does set the tone and the direction for the rest of the film that I will be involved. And you will face situations like this when you're making an observational film. And you will have to decide whether you want to be drawn in, whether that's legitimate or not. And so this is a very important question to be addressing here, I think. So what happens? Well, they get going, and the first thing they realize that what they have to do is they have to get expert opinion. They have to get the scientists on board to confirm that what they're seeing and smelling is really as bad as it looks. So they go around the universities trying to talk to scientists. And these men are very non-committal. They certainly don't want to be part of the bus tour. Now, interestingly, as the camera is filming this, it's very important that the camera give equal time. So the camera's on Jean-Pierre's shoulder, Jean-Pierre Lachapelle, the cameraman, and he's doing quite a good job of the way he covers the women's frustration and the men's evasiveness. And that sort of decision is very, very important to the sense of fairness of a film, that you're getting both sides of a story. And I think it's done quite well. So the bottom line is that they get really stymied again and again. Good news on their side is that they team up with a young graduate student called Ken Webb, who obviously knows what he's talking about. He's an expert we can trust. There's something also about him that's very engaging. He's not in any way playing for the camera. He's not after fame or attention. You can see that. And he takes the women around. They go around in a car. It's very impressive what's belching into the air. And so the film takes a turn of feeling that they're really on the right track, these women. Then comes a very dramatic moment in the film, and that is they decide they need to get a big name to front the bus, to be on the bus, to be the spokesman. And they go after a radio personality called Rod Blaker, who sometime later after this will become a politician. Now, Rod is a sort of smooth-faced, with heavy glasses, a coif of hair, and just a deep voice. And they send, for some reason, Anne. I say this is a strange choice because Anne is the most unsure of all of them. And when she gets to Blaker, she's sitting opposite. Again, the camera is in a very good place, I think, for what is going to happen, because it needs to easily be able to move backwards and forwards between these two people, very quickly without losing bits. And in fact, the camera very well covers this first encounter with Rod Blaker. Basically, Anne is telling him that they would like him to be on the bus, and you will be saying things about each of the polluters at each stop. And she says, of course, we don't want to annoy anybody. And Blaker's cue is, I don't mind if we annoy people. If we've got our facts straight, I'm very happy with getting up the noses of people who are polluting, if that is the case. He says, but what you're doing here is you are asking me to set up a trial situation in each one of these stops. We're going to be accusing these people. And I have to have the facts at my fingertips, reams of documents, so I know that what we are saying is correct. I don't mind my neck being on the line, but I have to be right. And she actually leaves the meeting very, very unsure that he is the one for them, that he's probably far too demanding than what they want. And she goes back to the group and she reports and says, how do I know? I'm just a housewife, maybe he's too demanding for us. And they comfort her. She has a cry, and Kay particularly say, well, we're just going to go back and tell this guy this is our show and we're going to do it this way, and if he doesn't like it, we don't want him. So anyway, here's Michael, the filmmaker, getting involved, because I realized that Anne has not communicated Blaker's challenge to their idea. And so before they go back the next day, I actually play the tape recording, the sound of the encounter between Anne and Blake. I play it to the other women so they will know what they're up for. Anyway, it doesn't put them off, but I'm playing an interventionist coaching role, you see, and which of course had started with Sheila asking me that question, what do you think? Here I am exercising what I think, that they don't know what they're in for with this guy. Anyway, they go back, and there's an interesting shot going through the corridors of his radio station, and they're following on behind. And I've shot that shot because I'm guessing that the scene that's coming is going to be relatively dramatic, and anticipation is just as interesting very often as resolution. And the anticipation does pay off, because the next shot we see, Blake is at a blackboard, and he's giving a lecture like a school teacher. He's now talking about where the bus stops. They should recruit people who live nearby, who are suffering from this pollution, and get them to testify. And he's saying the cameras will love this. You know, this is what journalists want. They want that sort of personal encounter. Kay, one of the women, seems to be asleep. And Sheila, she looks sort of pretty overwhelmed too. So this whole thing about they were going to give it to Blaker and tell him what for, all falls in a heap. They start doing what he says. They start going around the polluted areas, trying to meet people, saying, would you testify if our bus comes around? So they've picked up on his idea, and it's not such a bad one. So then we get to where they go back yet again to this guy, and every time they go to him, he says to them, ladies, you are not ready. But he says this time, I'll just relieve your anxiety because I will be on the bus. It's a very interesting sort of moment of the paternalistic male presence, which husband Larry and myself are also, in a way, part of that same relationship with the women, I think. Because the next scene, we're back at Sheila's house and having a drink after this third encounter with Blaker. And Larry says, I don't understand why you keep going back to him. I mean, if you are, it must mean that he's meeting some need for you. And Sheila says, yes, we have let him push us around a little bit. And I pipe up and I say, I would have told him where to get off. And Sheila comes right back at me and says, I don't believe that, Mike. I don't believe you would have told him where to get off, because every suggestion that Blaker has made, you've picked up as something that you think we should do. So this was an interesting encounter of the filmmaker actually getting caught out by his subject. Of course, I could have left it on the cutting room floor. I could have left it out because I don't look very good. I mean, I really look, very compromised. But I thought, no, that's the story. That's what happened. That's how it played out. And so it's in the film. The bus takes place. Blaker is on the bus. It seems to be relatively effective. They do stop. They do get some testimony from people living along the polluted bus line. And then it all ends with drinks at a hotel room, which Blaker had apparently tried to cancel. Anyway, there he is. And he's saying, Sheila is saying to him, well, Mr. Blaker, what do you think of our efforts, do you think? And what about the fact that we're a bunch of women? And he says, well, it's not that you're a bunch of women that's the problem. It's that you think it's a problem. And then he says, I think what you really need is you need a PR man who could put out the story, the hot message, and so on. And then a journalist called Norm Pascoe, who was on the bus, pipes up and says, I don't agree with you at all, Rod. I think they're very effective because they're sincere, they're unassuming, they're not that sort. And Blake says, oh, no, I don't want anything to do with the phony. So he completely contradicts his previous position. And Sally says to him, Rod, you called us persistent and finagling. And the whole thing ends on this sort of man-woman relationship of the time, when women were just beginning to find their voice and their strength, I guess. And so it's a wonderful record, I think, in terms of a citizens activist group. And it's a sort of a well-told story. And observational films do need, as I said, to tell a story. And this one does. Very modest film, but interestingly, Dave Jones, who did a book of my films, he thinks it's very good. And in fact, it was him who drew my attention to many things that I've just talked about that are in the film that I have to agree, I think he's right. I think it is pretty good. So that's Persistent and Finagling.